Welcome, class, to Chapter 4, African Americans in the Early Years. So this chapter is going to detail the early colonial time all the way up to just after the Civil War during Reconstruction. So we will look over a huge kind of vast sum of history here, of U.S. history, but African American history in this country is U.S. history. So a lot of it is intertwined and intermingled, and we have large topics to cover. And the big elephant in the room, of course, is going to be slavery. And so we will be discussing the formation of slavery, leading all the way up to the emancipation, and what came after that. And so some topics to consider for this chapter would be early colonial life and the evolution of all of these bondage systems. Post-American Revolution life, so what happened after the American Revolution, and post-Civil War life as well. And so we can kind of break up into these three different sections of our lecture. So for part one, bondage systems. Early sort of viewpoints, let's say if we were looking at the 16th century or so, 1500s, 1600s, as the Europeans are slowly but surely expanding, as they are traveling the seas and meeting different cultures. Obviously, they are still having a lot of interaction with Africa. Even previous to the 15th, 16th century, many of them have been trading with African kingdoms and tribes through the trans-Saharan trade networks, these vast networks of rich routes, right, that the merchants would take, spanning throughout Europe, Africa, Middle East, all the way up to the Silk Road in China, right? So obviously these cultures are familiar with one another to a certain extent. However, once we start getting introduced really to not just European contact with Africans, but Christianized, Protestant interaction, right? That is a different name of the game. Because once Europeans or any of these really God-worshipping, God-fearing individuals start to, interact with, said Africans or any kind of tribes, we start to see that, there is a certain part of them that is viewing their interaction from what is called a Eurocentric perspective, or a perspective that stems from your own worldview. And so, perhaps how some of the first interactions would be perceived as is, how were they viewing, Africans in general by analyzing their culture, their actual appearance, their traditions, their religion, etc. So just from the first onset, right? Obviously, those who were living in Africa at the time were of a different skin color, right? The melanin in the skin, right, is deeper. And so the color black, as within perhaps some biological, anthropological viewpoint, right, maybe kind of seeped into human genome. Is darkness or black is sometimes associated with fears, mysticism, perhaps evil worship, similar to how if you were a child, you could be scared of the dark, right? So perhaps that is a kind of like ancient DNA bloodline remnants that we have from the sub-Saharan plains of Africa, kind of survival, right? Those type of instincts. When they were looking a little deeper onto, let's say, a cultural level, their lifestyle, their clothes, their language, even sexual practices, they were a bit different than European customs and practices, so that automatically does not allow for a lot of bridging and connection between the two peoples and continents. And now that we're throwing in heavy religion into the mix with Protestantism, they were understanding that these African peoples, because they did not worship Jesus Christ and God, they were destined to go to hell, right? They were heathens. They did not, worship God. in the same fashion. And from their kind of European viewpoint, they were seeing them worshiping these idols, right, and kind of magic icons in nature. So false pagan gods, if you will. And so over time, it started to give these rising European powers more of a justification for beginning which would be one of the largest slave operations throughout the known world and throughout world history. And so some early form of this would be in part thanks to Prince Henry, aka the Navigator. He was an old Portuguese monarch who started essentially the entire kind of European colonization or exploration phase. He began to heavily invest in explorers and ships and to map out trade routes and coasts. And so the Portuguese ships started to sail around the coasts of Africa first, because the name of the game was to try to find maritime trade all the way to Asia, right? Money, money, money. And so in doing so, they started to map out all these coasts of Africa, and they started to notice that they could start to get a healthy surplus of labor from Africa. And this is what was going to start this kind of lucrative slave trade. I do have to preface this lecture and before I continue, because I don't want this entire lecture just to be, let's say, the evil Europeans, the evil whites creating the slave trade and slavery in general. I don't want that to be the only ultimate narrative, just because for centuries previous to this, slavery existed all throughout the known world, within Europe, Africa, the Middle East, etc. So in whatever forms or facets that it existed, people were already familiar with the subject. It typically was used, slavery that is, in a very kind of opportunistic manner. And what I mean by that is typically in, like, let's say, ancient history, once our peoples go to war with one another, if I am the victor of that war or engagement, I will take, let's say, some of the prisoners, right, POWs, prisoners of war, and they will be converted into whatever form of slaves. So that existed for many, many centuries, and people were very familiar with that system. Now that we are moving into, let's say, these centuries, and especially once we get to the Americas, right, and what's going to happen within the United States and the colonies, they are taking that ancient understanding of prisoners of war, converting them into slave labor, and they are evolving that into a more systematic, organized slave trade, right? So it's going to just be evolved somewhat. And so if we look at some early forms of the slave trade in the Atlantic by the Portuguese, we see that one still very famous castle that is still there today that you can see is called Alumina Castle. And so it is off the coast of Ghana, and it was one of the first, if not the first, trading posts built for this trade, right, of human flesh. And so it was a fortified position, because it was so lucrative, right, dealing with all of these individuals, that they needed to protect it with cannons against any naval or land attacks, etc. And we from the historical record, we can see hundreds of thousands of souls, if not maybe millions of souls, passed through this island alone, and obviously other kind of ports on the coast. Here is an excellent video. It's only a few minutes long, but it it goes inside Alumina Castle, shows some of the interior shots, and discusses with one of the tour guides how life was like for many of these folks, and he discusses a little bit more about the Portuguese slave trade. So very interesting to watch if you have a few minutes of time. And so here's Alumina Castle. As you can tell on the left-hand side, very fortified, trying to maintain its position. And so because of its location off the coast of Africa, it ended up being a perfect kind of pit stop between Africa and Europe, and of course the Americas later on. And, inside the castle, you could see such vaults such as this, where, large crowds of African slaves would be kept in very close proximity, almost like cattle. And many times, right, there's no restrooms, there's no sanitation facilities, nothing, right? They're being viewed and used as property. And so the floor over here, and this is from the video, right, from a couple slides ago, whether you watched it or not. The floor here, even today in the modern day, it has a very kind of red tinge to it, right? A very kind of red look. And it smells god-awful in the room. And the reason for that is so many souls passed through this tunnel and the kind of like chamber that all of the urine, menstrual cycles, and even feces ended up, kind of ingraining itself into the soil. And so it still remains there today. And the video kind of hopefully demonstrates that a little bit as the conversation is going on. But all of this, the Portuguese establishing these ports and fortresses, started this enormous slave trade that we know of today from our kind of American and U.S. history base. And so they started to originally ship people towards Brazil and the Caribbeans so that they could work in sugar plantations, right? They needed additional labor for that. And so, eventually, even the British got on board, right, with the Royal African Company to supply North America and the Caribbeans with their own slave labor. And so the Europeans start to really kind of use Africa as this resource supply of labor. And this introduces the concept and what is known today as the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is the slave trade route from Africa to the Americas. And so that long, arduous, and dangerous journey is known as the Middle Passage. Remember that for the midterm. Or the Atlantic slave trade, aka just known as the Middle Passage. And so this resulted in 3 steps, right? How the entire process occurred in 3 steps. Number 1, you first had to capture the slaves, right, within Africa. And so this dispels a lot of theories, or let's say, just common mythology, right, that some people just don't know about, because the typical narrative that I always hear is, white people came into Africa and stole everyone and shipped them off to the Americas and created the slave trade. That is a very simplistic view of it. And typically, the truth is much more nuanced than that. And so the very first stage is that how do you capture these individuals? Typically, the Europeans did not go in and capture them themselves. They ended up trading for them. So the Europeans would come in and pay with rum, cotton, gunpowder, pig iron, right? All these materials that the African tribes on the coast wanted. But in doing so, they paid them so that the coastal African tribes would go into the interior of Africa to their warring neighboring factions, and they would steal their people and sell them on the coasts. So the very, very first stage was Africans enslaving fellow Africans and selling them to the Europeans, knowing full well what would await them on the other side. So that hopefully dispels this kind of narrative of, it was only the Europeans that just came in and stole everyone. It's much more nuanced than that. Number 2, you had to move the captives to the coasts for sales, right? Pretty standard. You would bring them to the coasts in various kind of, selling blocks or auctions. And so depending on what the customers wanted, what the territories wanted, what kind of plantations were needing the labor, they started to pick, right, the various individuals and kind of put them on the ships. And number 3, the most dangerous of the 3, transporting all of these captive peoples to their final destination in the Americas or Brazil for work. Now, this was a terrible journey. It was horribly dark, damp, packed with people, unsanitary. Many times they would get no exercise, terrible diets, and the people would die in the millions. Some estimate that perhaps around 20 million slaves were taken from Africa in the totality of this entire slave trade and brought to the Americas, the Caribbeans, South America, etc. Upwards of 40% perhaps died at sea. Our historical analysis and records always kind of keep changing these figures as we're getting new information. However, this is, terrible. So perhaps around 8 million perished on the high seas. And initially, folks did not really know, right? If you were, let's say, part of these African tribes and you were captured, you did not really know what was waiting for you. Eventually, they started to understand why they wanted all of these African captives and for what purpose. Initially, when they didn't know, like, why are these white Europeans just buying up all of these, black folk? Initially, some of the actual understanding within the tribes on the coast of Africa was that they were cannibals. So, that doesn't make it any better, right? For the fellow Africans that were capturing their own people and enslaving them and selling them to the Europeans, like, oh, let's just sell them to the cannibals. But over time, that kind of narrative of cannibals went over towards we understand what they're doing. Here's a wonderful primary source we have of Thomas Phillip. He was a slave trader describing the Middle Passage in 1693 at one of its heydays. And I've underlined some key relevant parts of the passage. The Negroes are so willful and loth to leave their own country that they have often leapt out of the canoes, boat and ship, into the sea, and kept under water till they were drowned, to avoid being taken up and saved by our boats, which pursued them, they having a more dreadful apprehension of Barbados, that's the Caribbeans, than we can have of hell, though in reality they live much better there than they're in their own country. But home is home. We have likewise seen divers of them eaten by the sharks, of which a prodigious number kept about the ships in this place. And I have been told will follow her hence to Barbados. For the dead Negroes that are thrown overboard in the passage, we had about 12 Negroes did willfully drown themselves, and others starved themselves to death. For 'tis their belief that when they die, they return home to their own country and friends again. Now, this primary source details that as these folks started to understand what was waiting for them on the other side of this journey, many of them chose death. Many of them wanted to escape. Obviously, this was not in large numbers, right? Because many of them were shackled up and captive. However, this shows the kind of unfortunate reality that this was just a terrible endeavor. And my main question that's going to kind of factor into the annotated bibliography assignment later is this a primary or secondary source? Answer: this is a primary source because it was written within the time period itself. So if we are looking at the Middle Passage, this is a primary source because it is written during the sequence of events of the Middle Passage. If, let's say, this were a source written 200 years after the Middle Passage, that would be a secondary source because you are writing about it after the fact. So here's a visual diagram and map to show, how the population movements were going. So a vast majority were sent to Brazil, right, to work on the various plantations and farms. Many of them were sent into other sectors of South America, to Mexico, the Caribbeans, and of course British North America, or let's say the early colonies and what would eventually be the United States of America. What is interesting to note here, from all of these locations that the peoples were being shipped off to, out of all of these locations, over time, only the American colonies saw an increase in African populations. And we're going to get into that later as to why that was. But essentially, all of the other locations here, they did not practice what was called eugenics. They did not practice the intentional breeding of the peoples. North America, right, the American slave sector, was the only one that eventually understood that, oh, it's cheaper for us to just have them reproduce and repopulate amongst their own instead of us buying and shipping them from Africa. And so that's a very interesting kind of dynamic to see as we're kind of analyzing all throughout the Western Hemisphere here. And here would be a typical representation of a slave ship. So, as you can tell, these individuals are literally packed like sardines. It is not a cruise ship. It is not, a wonderful way for you to spend a couple of months at sea. And it was, like I said, terrible conditions, very unsanitary. And the fact that they are being, let's say, placed like this within the storerooms shows and is evidence of the fact that they are not being treated like human beings. They are being treated like property, like chattel, like objects that you can just buy and sell. And so the entire kind of idea of slavery, right, is here. And so this would be kind of a typical site. Having the ship, putting them below hand in various chains and shackles to make sure that there's not going to be any rebellions or insurrections. However, and if you look at here, and this is a wonderful series called Roots that you can watch on Amazon Prime of the Middle Passage, and it details an African American, no, not an African American. Well, I guess so, but it details a man's life story from, let's say, being captured within Africa to being put on this ship and then shipped off to the Americas. And this little snippet, like what, 2-3 something minutes like that, is during their interactions and during the Middle Passage itself when they're on the ship. It can get a little bit graphic at times, so just, disclaimer. But if anyone wants to watch this on Amazon Prime, it kind of gives, as far as I can see in recent sort of documentary type of series, a very realistic portrayal of this entire, Middle Passage. And so, slavery. Let us define it. Let us discuss it. Slavery itself is an institutionalized system of obtaining people without their consent to become legal property and to forcibly obey others' commands. Essentially, you will have a master and you will obey their commands. Pretty much the entirety of your humanity is stripped away from you as an individual and you just become property. You are chattel. If anyone wants to get into law school, right, and become a lawyer, once you start to read some of the old cases, they still use chattel within the cases itself. And so chattel means an item of property. And so if I treat you like chattel, I am not looking at you as though you are a human being with thoughts and feelings. I am looking at you as a piece of property that I can buy and sell at whim, as though you are an inanimate object. And so once Europeans and later the Americas and the colonies started to grow a demand for agricultural products that stem from tobacco, rice, indigo, all of these require large amounts of labor, right, to pick them and to harvest them. And so initially they started to think to themselves, okay, well, how are we going to, meet our demand of labor? Their first inclination in the Americas, in the colonies, were to get indentured servants to work the fields. An indentured servant is somebody that lawfully agrees to give up their rights and work for X amount of time. So many of these were actually white Europeans working on the fields, working in the farms and plantations. But this was not a very good system for them to maintain over time because the number of indentured servants was kind of shoddy at best because not everyone wanted to just voluntarily enlist for this. And number two, if somebody were to escape, they really quickly just blended into the local populace. So it was very hard to track them down. So they thought, okay, how about Native Americans, right? We're conquering our way through the Americas. We're pushing west. How about Native Americans? But they were very susceptible to European diseases, as we have talked about in previous lectures. So they were dying, unfortunately, in droves. Not a very stable source of labor. And finally, they came to the conclusion, how about Africa? This, to them, ended up being a very viable solution because, number one, they were very easily identifiable in the majority of the population because of, obviously, of their skin color if they were to run away. Number two, they were actually immune to many of these European diseases because they had that long-held interaction and all of that trans-Saharan trade routes that I was talking about earlier. They had so much interaction that they built up immunity, and they had immunity towards diseases such as malaria. And so slowly but surely, this kind of starts to morph and change, right? And slavery starts to really kind of grow into its own. And so slavery in colonial America can be divided into two different categories, the Charter Generation and the Plantation Generation. So the Charter Generation were those who were the very first kind of onset Africans who were arriving in the United States, or excuse me, not the United States at this time, the colonies. And they were very well versed, right? They were businessmen, they were traders, they spoke many languages within their African cultures as well as English and other European languages. They were educated. And so the Charter Generation was not what our modern conception of slavery in the movies tell us. The Charter Generation was closer towards the indentured servants, right, that we talked about, the white European indentured servants coming over. And so they were working side by side. And, many times, they still had various freedoms. And after working for a few years, they could buy their own freedom. And so as this system was kind of progressing, the plantation owners started to see that this also is not that viable of a source, right? If they could just buy their own freedom after a few amount of years, our turnover rate is very fast and quick. And so we start to see the development of what you and I know from the movies and whatnot, the Plantation Generation. So these are Africans who came to the colony between 1619 and afterwards, especially going into the 17 and 1800s. And so this is a slow process. The 1600s, we started to see laws started to shift. They started to change. They started to gradually incorporate this full-scale slave institution by prohibiting interracial sex, telling them they cannot possess firearms. Most importantly, instead of you temporarily working, such as an indentured servant, you are now a lifetime servant, right? Your entire life is now given towards the plantation or the quote-unquote master. And it is hereditary servitude. So if you are born into a family of slaves, you yourself are now a slave as well. And so we start to see this shift and this dynamic. The long-term results of this, and this is a very general statement that I'll make, but the long-term investments, well, in the short term, the plantation owners had a very great, essentially, business model here, and they were making vast amounts of profits. Long term, however, it would lead to an immense amount of social insecurity within the North American colonies and the United States later on, and it would start to sow the seeds of paranoia in the South, eventually us getting into the Civil War, right, and all of those ramifications. And so, we have obviously a lot to discuss here in terms of people who were enslaved, during early colonial America and afterwards. And so, like I said before, African American history is U.S. history, right? It is ingrained in the history. So it is not something that we can, merely shrug off. How was life like in the northern versus southern states as we're going through colonial America? The northern states were much more mild treatment of these individuals. Many of them were allowed to join congregational churches. Their marriages amongst each other was recognized by the state, and they were receiving limited education. And on top of that, only perhaps 10 to 15% of all of these northern states saw, let's say, Africans, right? Black, populations. And so they were not seen as a major, quote unquote, threat to the status quo. In addition to that, we had, if any of you are fans of early U.S. history, the Quakers in New England. There was a particular religious group or sect. I believe we talked about them in a previous lecture here. But because they were a very humane group of religious thinkers and believers, and they believed in the fair treatment of all individuals, regardless of race, that cultural religious mentality kind of proliferated itself into the northern states. And so they had a much better relation there. Plus, the North was typically always a industrial heavy economy, meaning that they did not need large surpluses of labor, right? The machines were doing the bulk of the work, and you needed a few folks here and there to kind of help out and toil and make sure everything was working properly. Unlike the South. The South was a heavily agricultural based economy. You needed many individuals, you needed labor, right? And because of that, the more and more people they started to ship in, the demographic population started to shift. And so instead of being, let's say, 10% of the state population, started to grow to 30, 40, 50, 60% of the state population. That causes that fear and paranoia, right, that I'm talking about, that was going to start to develop. And so eventually, the institution of slavery became even more brutal, even more repressive, because they were fearful of riots, uprisings, revolts, right, as they should be. But we see a complete stark contrast between, let's say, northern freedmen, right? African Americans living in the North, right? Toiling away, trying to make a good life for themselves, opening up their own businesses, living their life, educating themselves and their children, being the best form of Americans that we can, imagine, versus their brothers and sisters in the South, forced to live on the plantations. And as we see here, right, usually at gunpoint. And so, a very, very stark contrast and difference there. Now, post-American Revolution. So once the American Revolution was underway, we started to see that there was a growing development of, the Enlightenment ideals. America at this time and the founding fathers were, going up against the greatest empire the world had seen up to this point in time, the British Empire, spanning all around the globe, right? They were a superpower in their own right. And so they were taking these kind of Enlightenment ideals of reason, natural rights, God-given human rights, other principles that slavery could not really, justify itself. Theories of representative government, emphasizing that one should vote for their beliefs and see this change implemented into society. Individual rights about freedoms, liberties, equality for all under the law. And so we're also going to see the Continental Army, and I'll put up a couple of promotional posters soon, where we're going to see the enlistment of thousands of black soldiers who would actually fight for the United States to be born, right, and to branch away from the British Empire. And then they themselves are going to become freedmen because of this. And so as all of these things started to progress, the conversation within the founding fathers and others started to condemn slavery and began the conversation of discussing its hypocrisy. And so previous to this, the institution was still alive and well. But now, folks are really overthinking everything, right? And trying to mull over in their heads, what is the meaning of government? What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of power relations? Is slavery justified? And we're going to get into some of those conversations, more and more right now. And tying into our previous lectures, I remember we were discussing the Quakers. We were discussing other kind of up and up religious groups, the Great Awakening, and so from those conversations, right, slavery is over time going to have less and less of an argument. And so, as we start to see the birth of the nation, we do start to see both a more brutal and repressive system of the institution of slavery, but at the same time, we do start to see at least the conversation getting started of the hypocrisy. And so, what was life like for, let's say, the African Americans in the North? So because the North states were more industrial focused, more textile focused, less labor intensive focused, like the agricultural South, the populations were relatively low for African Americans in the North. The ratio was not a fearful one, and so, they had a much better time. And many people in the North started to become very pro-abolitionist, and so they started to advocate for the elimination of slavery. The Quakers, like we discussed, had their religious views, that all people should be treated humanely. And so we start to see in 1775 the first onsets of anti-slavery societies being established in various states. And so, like I said, it's going to be almost like the tale of two Americas, right? Or the tale of two cities, if you read it. We're literally going to have the North start to branch off and become more and more kind of pro-abolition, and we're going to see the South branch off and become more and more pro-slavery, based off of the economic realities, based off of their entrenched social and political views as well. We start to see African Americans in the North also have a great strength in community. The community is going to become so powerful for them because they are still able to, join and attain their conventions, organizations, establish fraternities, get into educational programs, the church becoming a central part of the community as well, and the culture. And so a lot more freedom in the North, right? Where they could worship freely, they could work freely, and there was a bit less of the, let's say, oppressive racist mentality. Whereas in the South, we see a much different tale. So because the South had a much greater dependence on labor, we see that obviously they need higher populations, and slavery should be, in their minds, entrenched as an institution. And so once we started to really pick up, let's say, the cotton gin, which was an invention that could easily separate cotton from the seeds, thereby giving you, that much more, cotton production, we see that the South starts to produce at one point in time around 2/3 of the world's cotton production. And so as we're going to start to see by the right before the onset of the Civil War, if the South is exporting 2/3 of the world's cotton, that is an enormous amount of profit. And so they do not want to let this go, right? We start to see anti-abolition culture in the South. So by 1860, 4 million African Americans lived in the totality of the South compared to the 7 million whites. And so this is an enormous amount of, let's say, black population in the South, which once again feeds into that mentality of paranoia, of potential riots, of potential revolts that could happen. They're given pretty much no freedoms. They are exploited sexually, no legal standing, no marriage licensing, no education, etc., and living in poor living conditions. So obviously, all of the things that we have kind of ingrained in our lexicon of knowledge from movies and media and portrayals, right, of these kind of towns and times. And so here are large cotton gins, right, kind of sifting through all of this cotton. And so although cotton gins were still utilizing a lot of it, labor was still heavily used. One wonderful highlight, the Underground Railroad by Harriet Tubman, who, fun fact, she's going to change the $20 bill. So instead of Andrew Jackson, in a number of years, I think they pushed it back to 2024. But Harriet Tubman is going to be the face of the new $20 bill. They pushed it back on a couple of different occasions, but she is going to officially be on our 20s. So, hurrah. But she was a abolitionist and an activist, and famously made some 13 missions to save, numerous amounts of people, right, herself, that were enslaved. Some families, some friends, and working for others as well. So she was originally born in Maryland as a slave, beaten and whipped, suffering eventually a traumatic head injury from a metallic object being thrown in her direction. Not intentionally at her, but, just struck her, happenstance. Leading to some hallucinations she would have over her lifetime. Premonitions of meeting God, which were influencing her devout religion, right, and her viewpoints on life. Eventually, she escaped to Philadelphia. But upon escaping to Philadelphia, she did not want to, leave all of her family and friends, in this kind of terrible situation. And so she returned to Maryland later to start rescuing her family. And this started the kind of entire Underground Railroad narrative, where we have these secret routes, safe houses, missions, right, to save all of these enslaved peoples from the South and bring them to the Free States and or Canada. And eventually, Tubman, once the Civil War started, she ended up joining the Union Army and became a scout and a spy for them, and was the first woman to lead an armed expedition in the war. She led the Combahee Ferry mission, which liberated more than 700 slaves. So I think, personally, that she has definitely earned her spot as being the face of the $20 bill, right? And kind of solidifying herself as one of the greatest kind of American stories. And so Harriet Tubman, definitely, an inspirational figure, right? For us to see that even in the midst of darkness, even in the midst of, let's say, these terrible situations that colonial America and early U.S. Histories have shown us, that there are good people in the world, right? Fighting the good fight wherever tragedy and oppression may be. Part 3, post-Civil War. So this is where most of my classes typically starts their understanding of African American history. And so I'm sorry that it took up to part 3, but I wanted to give the full breadth of context, right? Why did slavery happen? How these folks were brought over to the States, before we really start to get into the nitty-gritty details of how life was like once, right, we were here. And so we're going to look at post-Civil War life right now, from 1865 all the way up to approximately 1900. And then later on, in a few chapters, we will revisit African Americans, and that will be from the 1900s all the way up to the Civil Rights Movement, right, and more so the present. And so, let us start. So, the Civil War. The Civil War was a crux national debate over slavery. We had many public intellectuals fiercely debate the religious and social merits, or not having them, of slavery. And so people were starting to use their religion as an excuse for abolishing slavery, for their cultural and social beliefs, for abolishing it as an institution. And so, eventually the Democratic and Republican sides, the North and the South, they could not contend with one another no longer, and we ended up getting the Civil War. And I will spare you the details because I can spend an entire couple of lectures on the Civil War. And I have, if anyone wants to ever join in from my History 11 class, Early U.S. History, or let's say if you want more modern, History 12, or 117, 118, depending on which campus you're on. But definitely a very interesting time. But at the end of the Civil War, all right, after all of the bloodshed, the battles, everything is said and done, the Union armies are marching into the South, right, victoriously. Robert E. Lee is captured and surrenders, and we start to see that the Union is victorious over the Confederacy, over the South. But now the main, very difficult question for them is, now that we won, how do we meaningfully reintegrate the North and the South and sew things back together? And on top of that, because of the Emancipation Proclamation, how do we have these 4+ million African American individuals? How do we integrate them into society, right? And this became the true kind of question of the day and age. Some of them were automatically, freed and had a leg up as far as military pay goes, because we had many individuals actually join the Union in fighting the Civil War. And we have posters such as these, right? To colored men, we need you. Men of color, to arms, to arms. And so we had an enormous amount of individuals, approximately 100,000+ African Americans, switch over and start to fight towards, fight with the Union against the Confederacy. And we start to see promotional kind of posters and magazine covers. Come and join us, brothers. And kind of showing this, view, right, of, fighting alongside your, your fellow man, your fellow brothers, for, let's say, the Union, for the United States of America. And so this, brings us to this video that I found from the Smithsonian, which did a fantastic job, and I believe has a very great message. So essentially, how Black Union soldiers went from slavery to forever free. And the video details various crucial moments in U.S. history where, from our American Revolution to our Civil War, etc., African Americans have always been there at the forefront, fighting for freedoms, fighting for the nation. And so once again, completely intertwined with U.S. history, right? They are U.S. history. And so it's a very good, it's only a couple minutes long or a few minutes long. So definitely give it a watch. I think it's pretty interesting. And so after the Civil War, we had to contend with, like I said, how do we integrate the North and the South? How do we integrate it back together to hopefully create a peaceful, prosperous nation? Much more easily said than done, clearly. And so the North's Union was victorious over the South's Confederacy. And some members of the African American community actually sat down with General Sherman, one of the generals, the Union generals that was in charge of kind of pushing through the South and winning. And so they started to discuss what they understood as freedom. In terms of slavery, that receiving, by irresistible power, the work of another man and not by his consent, was seen as slavery. To be free meant that to place us where we can reap the fruit of our own labor and take care of ourselves. And so the entire concept of I want my work to, stay mine. I do not want to work forcibly for anyone else, right? That is the crux of me being free. And this entire era of Reconstruction, as it is called, the years after the Civil War, trying to reconstruct the nation, to heal the North and the South. It is a wonderful ideal that they had, but in practice, extremely difficult to follow through on. And, we start to see over time that Congress is going to amend the Constitution to allow African Americans citizenry, equality before the law, the right to vote, etc. But just because from the top down the laws start to change does not mean that socially on the ground things are going to change as fast. Because in the South, because the Confederacy was the losing traitorous side of the war, we see, bodies after bodies strewn across the landscape. Fathers, sons, cousins, uncles of the South, all dead. And the cities and the railroads and the industries in the South all completely just, shattered. And so from a Southerner's perspective, a white Southerner's perspective, the South is absolutely, it was torn, right? It was ruined. And so they were obviously feeling some type of animosity. Now, because of all of this animosity, there's obviously increased tensions. And because of these increased tensions, the North and Congress decided to create the Freedmen's Bureau, essentially to send federal agents, which were the Freedmen's Bureau, federal agents down to the South to maintain peace. They were to be peacekeepers. And on top of that, to try to reintegrate as much as possible. So some of their responsibilities were to establish schools, provide aid to the poor and elderly, and also settle many legal disputes between whites and blacks. So if they were having a contractual dispute over, let's say, land or anything else, a freedman can go there, and he was essentially the court. He was the judge. He can make the ruling right then and there, and it was law. The reason for doing this is because many of the whites started to unfairly drag them, not literally, but figuratively, right? Kind of drag the process through the court systems. And so instead of kind of, getting the courts involved and kind of bankrupting a lot of the newly freed African Americans, the Bureau agents were able to kind of dispel justice right there and there. And so, we have this wonderful clip and video of the Freedmen's Bureau and the various records that they have of all of these, freed individuals. And so the modern Freedmen's Bureau, records are being utilized actually to kind of help grow the family tree line, right? If anyone has ever taken those like DNA testing, right, those cheek swab tests from like 23andMe, so they're taking a lot of the actual they're taking a lot of the written record here, and trying to remap family histories, because a lot of these families were separated over the plantations. And so now, right, you can kind of go through this new modern online system and say, oh, wow, I have cousins living in X, Y, and Z state. And this is a nice, I think it's around 8 to 10 minutes or so, a wonderful kind of snippet of the PBS documentary about the Freedmen's Bureau, detailing some of the dangers and realities that a lot of these, federal government agents had to deal with going into a very hostile South that did not want them to take the side of the African Americans, but obviously they did. And this is one of those schools that they built, because the Freedmen's Bureau was in charge of helping build schools, raise education levels. Once we started to see all of these emancipated individuals, here in the in this imagery, we see people of all ages coming forth to learn how to read and write, because one of the greatest advantages that you can have in life, right, is to be literate, is to know how to read, how to write, because that is going to, especially in this day and age, give you that much more advantage when dealing with legal contracts, when trying to read about sales and such. And obviously they were peacekeepers. We're not going to get too much into the details here, but as you could imagine, farmers, black and white, started to go at each other's throats as integration starts to form, as Reconstruction is kind of moving forward. And so they are truly acting as peacekeepers here, right? Literally trying to stop them from slitting each other's throats. And as integration is coming forth, we start to see a increased response from the South, right? Trying to say that the Freedmen's Bureau is, kind of babying the African American, right? To say here, right, in the words of this poster, right, that the Negro is in idleness at the expense of whites, right? And that the president and Congress are not supporting you, but they are supporting the Negro. And so even the way that the person is portrayed here, right, kind of just lounging about in front of the congressional building, this is an entire narrative that was spun and created and perpetuated by the South, starting here onto the next number of years, in order to essentially say, yes, we understand that things are integrating again. However, to the detriment of the South and the people. And so we start to get what was known as the Black Codes, the precursor of what we will talk about later during our revisit of the African American community in our class. This is the precursor to the Jim Crow laws. And so these are the Black Codes. Beginning from 65, 66, at the very end of the Civil War, these were passed by many southern states to restrict African American freedoms and to compel them to work in a labor economy based on low wages or debt. Essentially, as the economies of the South are getting converted from a slave-based agricultural system to a free market economy, right? Because slavery has been abolished. They had to make certain concessions. So some rights that they granted them, right, were legalized marriage, ownership of property, limited access to judicial courts. However, the southern states did not want them, obviously, to get a leg up on their people. And so they started to deny them other rights, such as you cannot testify against whites, which is a big one, especially if you had contractual disputes. No serving on juries or state militia. And, most importantly, probably, no voting. And these individuals were often also forced to sign yearly labor contracts to one employer and were arrested if they ended up refusing. And so the North's reaction to all of these unjust Black Codes were, obviously, nobody assumed that Reconstruction was going to happen in a day, but, Jesus, this was blatant mistreatment and blatant kind of bad faith conduct. And so you would think that right after a bloody war of 600,000+ American deaths, that this issue would be solved. It was not, unfortunately. There's many more reasons for this, and I get into it in much more detail in my actual U.S. history courses. But as far as our class, Reconstruction did not live up to the idealized version that it should have been. And essentially, white supremacy in the South remained alive. A lot of the hatred and animosity towards losing the war was still there. And this whole kind of forced reintegration and reconstruction of African Americans and whites in the country, it was something that they could not stomach. And so at the very worst onset of it, we start to get these fraternal organizations. You probably might have heard of them. The Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. And so at the very worst of the society in the South, led by the Democratic Party, of all people, the KKK ended up being the right arm of the Democratic Party, essentially using fear and intimidation tactics to get what they want. And so the imagery here on the left-hand side is a perfect representation of everything that happened at this time. The Ku Klux Klan member shaking hands with the White League. Underneath, the Union as it was, right? This kind of the lost America, right? And then worse than slavery, right? The African American family, the wife, the husband, right? And the child kind of, struggling underneath this enormous weight. And of course, behind them, this imagery of a tree on the left-hand side of the wife of a lynching. And so a lot of these imageries and magazine covers and newspaper article portrayals, right, were pretty brutal and honest in their opinions. But these Black Codes, these Black laws in these various southern states, they did not make it, they made it very apparent of what their intention was, which is essentially to repress this new population group that was thrust into American politics, and so to retain the power balance in America. And so let us go through some of Louisiana's black codes. And my apologies for just reading it off of here. Let's go with the first one. Any Negro found drunk within the said parish shall pay a fine of $5, or in default thereof work 5 days on the public road, or suffer corporal punishment. So essentially, if you're found drunk, you either have to pay a large fine or corporal punishment, thrown in jail or worse. That was probably abused to all hell. Number 2, no Negro who is not in the military service shall be allowed to carry firearms. That goes against the Second Amendment, right? The NRA loves their Second Amendment, but this goes entirely against it, right? So if you take away a people's rights to protect themselves, then essentially you can abuse the power dynamics. Number 3, no Negro shall be permitted to preach, exhort, or otherwise declaim to congregations of colored people. So they're taking their right away to freedom of religion and to worship. No Negro shall be permitted to rent or keep a house within said parish. Early gentrification, right? Sectioning them off to various parts of the cities to live in, not living side by side with whites. And violators of these laws were subject to fines, whipping, branding, jail, etc. Now, a fine, you know what a fine is. You're paying money. Whipping, right? A typical crack of the whip. Branding was much more brutal. For those of you who don't know what branding is you take your insignia or initials, whatever it is, right? Typically, let's say on a metal rod, you stick that metal rod in hot coals until it gets red hot, and then you pierce it into somebody's flesh until it's nice and searing, and you take it off, thereby branding them forever with whatever marks or initials you have. This is very brutal codes written here. And modern day relevance to this is that we are still seeing today in African American, immigrant, Latino communities a lot of voter suppression laws, ID laws, etc. There is, of course, the conservative argument, and it is true to a certain extent. I'm not going to sit here and just say that all of this argument is entirely on the left liberal side. Although there is, of course, always going to be individuals who, let's say, abuse the system, undocumented folks who are not, let's say, supposed to vote and are kind of doing it from other means. Recent statistics and studies have shown that from, let's say, all of the individuals, right, that, let's say, comprise, undocumented immigration, only a small percentage, let's say, have, from what they found, fraudulent voting. But these kind of voter suppression laws that we see on Fox News and see in other kind of channels, right, and kind of red states, it is, seen as, in practice, another further way of kind of keeping the status quo, right, alive. And this is a wonderful movie clip. It's like a couple minutes long with Mr. Matthew McConaughey. All right. And so it shows the black codes within this clip of the Free State of Jones movie. And it shows, I'm not sure whether Matthew McConaughey here is supposed to play an actual Friedman, right? The peacekeeper we were talking about. But this kind of shows, what life was like for a peacekeeper during these times, like a Friedman. And so these white individuals here, right, the lawmen, if you will, are escorting these African-American gentlemen in the South to go and vote for their Republican ticket. The Republicans at this time were pro-abolition. And so it kind of portrays this nice tense moment of the Democrats in the South trying to prevent them from voting, and these individuals trying to help them exercise their new right of vote. And so, a lot of this kind of deals with our conversations of, what is freedom, kind of ramping down from our conversation of slavery. Freedom could mean a bunch of different things for you. Does it mean not to be chained, not to be enslaved? Does freedom mean that you have the right to vote, own property, that you are equal under the law? Or even modernly, if you think about your own time, your own day, your own year, do you perhaps not have enough time on your hands? Or maybe your choices are made for you, or perhaps your mom or dad are trying to restrict your freedom of love, and or perhaps you are struggling financially, and for you freedom is to have money, right? all of us can kind of relate to this on some level, right? And, try to appreciate the fact that, freedom is innate to us all. We want all to have the ability to choose what we do, right, on a daily basis. And so when that is taken away from us, or that is even worse so, publicly stated that we have it, but on the side, manipulated to the point where we really don't have it, that is something for us to definitely discuss as a people and as a nation. And post-emancipation life, right, as we're getting into the, late 1800s, as we're trying to rebuild the United States, as we're trying to repair the damage of slavery towards the African American populations, we start to see that churches play an enormous role in the African American community. Worship, perhaps, was one of the greatest factors for them getting through slavery. The church hymns, the songs, the chants, the prayers, these were instrumental in the community. And even later on, once we're going to view the civil rights movement under Martin Luther King Jr., he himself was a member of the church, right? He was a preacher. And so that really played into this, conversation well. They wanted more political freedom. And so we're going to see over time that they're going to get more and more and more freedoms granted to them through the Constitution, through the 14th, 15th Amendments, voting rights, etc. And one of the most famous African Americans of this time and generation, Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave himself, who educated himself up to to become one of the greatest American intellects, right, of all time, said himself, "Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. Essentially, if you do not have the right to vote, you are not free." And so, very famously, Frederick Douglass, as a young man, went in front of this university group, right? He went in front of this, lecture with the emerite professor there. And so at the very ripe young age of around like 19, 20 years old, he went in front of the group and gave his speech, right? His thesis, his arguments. And eventually the emerite professor stands up and holds up his hand and says, "Do we have here chattel or a man?" Chattel, of course, being what we discussed earlier, a piece of property. And everyone unanimously said, "A man." And so his political and educational academic career was born, and growing into the man we see here on the right-hand side, one of the greatest intellects of the time and generation. Here is a short snippet and biography, a nice video detailing some of his works and contributions. I would definitely recommend for you to spend the 3 minutes or so to watch it. And here is a very interesting, this is around, I think, 8 minutes. This is James Earl Jones, the voice of Darth Vader, the voice of Mufasa, right? One of the best voice actors alive today. He reads one of Frederick Douglass's historic speeches. What to the slave is 4th of July. So since we are now coming up on the 4th of July, right, in a couple of days, I thought this was very relevant. And so he, in his written speech, clearly and articulately details the absolute hypocrisy of what the 4th of July should mean or does mean to the African American people. And it is a fascinating watch. Please give this some time if you can. As we're moving through some time here, over time, we start to see that African Americans are understanding that all of these black codes and all of these manipulative laws are, let's say, being used against them. And so they start to take up the legal and political arm of America, trying to vote in around 2,000+ of their own into public offices, right? So the idea here is get inside the belly of the beast and change things for the better. And so even today, right, we consistently are seeing in various states these heated elections, right, of these people kind of moving through and trying to change the system from inside. Eventually, we get, right, more representation in Congress, within the Senate, within the House of Representatives. Truly kind of seeing the advancement, right, of the two tails of America, as it seems. And of course, unfortunately, we have the Ku Klux Klan. We will get into this again during later lectures, but the Ku Klux Klan was essentially the Ku Klux Klan was essentially the repercussion of all of this. They were white Christians, white supremacists at the very, very extreme of the political spectrum, and they were the military arm of the Democratic Party in the South. They wanted to use terrorist tactics and fear and intimidation to essentially scare anyone from doing what they did not want them to do. And eventually, Congress themselves actually said that they were outlawing these terrorist societies and that they would use the army to dispel them. And so the KKK is like a bad venereal disease. You get rid of it once, it comes back again. And so this time around, President Grant, right after the Civil War, they ended up getting rid of them, tossing a lot of them into jail. But a few decades later, they would resurge, right? And even today, we see the repercussions of that with some more modern topics like Charlottesville. And here we have what a lot of Southerners are viewing as, oh, well, if we have a lot of African Americans in Congress or in these political, stations, the imagery at the right, kind of shows them arguing, and Lady Liberty is kind of trying to hold peace. So once again, the South is trying to spin this narrative, right, of, there will be chaos if we let these folks into society at the highest levels of office, which is not true. And at the very, very extreme, once again, the KKK with their cross burnings, with their nooses, right, and all the imagery that we have with the Klansmen, that is a way for them to hide their identities while trying to maintain the status quo. And so I'm sorry if the lecture is a little bit more on the kind of real side, but this is the history we're dealing with. The second half of our lecture, the civil rights movement, once we're going to get back to African Americans, is a bit more upbeat. And so we're going to kind of see and focus on the good and all the changes that are going to happen at this time. But my final thoughts on Reconstruction are, even though it was originally meant to unify the nation, obviously did not hold up to those ideals. The community was, struggling for a long time. It would have to go through segregation and various U.S. Supreme Court laws that make segregation and all this discrimination legal. And it would take all the way up to the 1960s for the civil rights movement to really kind of take shape and hold. And obviously, with our recent George Floyd protests, lingering effects are still happening in society today. But with that, I leave you with the end of chapter 4. Thank you so much for staying here. Thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. And I hope I helped consolidate some of the information into a nice kind of digestible narrative for you. I hope you all have a wonderful week. And chapter 5 is going to be on next. So I'll see you during the next one.